What if everything you were taught about the Sioux was constructed? Not misunderstood, not simplified, constructed. There is a people so deliberately misrepresented in history books, in Hollywood films, in government documents that even their name, the name the entire world calls them, was given to them by their enemies. And now, after decades of silence, after locked museum archives and hair samples stored in darkness, after ancient DNA extracted from a scalp lock that sat in the Smithsonian for over a century, the science has finally spoken. And what it revealed has shattered nearly every assumption we ever made. There's a question that historians have avoided for a very long time. Not because they didn't have access to the information, not because the technology wasn't available, but because the answer, once revealed, forces a complete reconstruction of one of the most important narratives in American history. The question is this: who were the Sioux, really? Not in the movies, not in the treaties, not in the museum exhibits with the headdresses and the painted horses. Who were they in their DNA? Who were they before the name was given, before the borders were drawn, before the U.S. government decided what story the world was going to be told? Because here is something that most people walking through life today have never been told. The word Sioux is not their word. It was never their word. It belongs to their enemies. The Ojibwe, a rival Great Lakes nation, used a term, Nadawesiwak, to describe them when French fur traders moving westward asked who these people were. A French interpreter shortened it, distorted it, and handed the world a name built from a misunderstanding. What the Ojibwe elder actually said, according to tribal language scholars, referred to the people of the snake-like river, meaning the Mississippi. But what the world received was a slur, repurposed as an identity, embedded into every treaty, every government document, every history book ever written. The word Sioux stems from the westward expansion of the French fur traders in the northern Wisconsin Lakes region and Minnesota. Think about that. The name burned into global consciousness for 400 years was never theirs to begin with. Their real name, the name they gave themselves, is Otsati-Sakowin, the people of the Seven Council Fires. 7 distinct nations, united by language and blood, operating not as a primitive tribe, but as a structured, deliberate political confederation centuries before European contact. And this is where the first myth begins to collapse, because the image that was sold to the world, the lone warrior on horseback, children of the open plain, people born of the buffalo and the wind, that image is geographically, historically, and genetically wrong. And the DNA is now proving it in a way that cannot be argued with. Here is what most people are not seeing. The Sioux had a reputation for being great horsemen, bison hunters and warriors in the Old West, in the plains and Rocky Mountains. Nevertheless, Sioux ancestors had lived without horses for hundreds of years in the woodlands around what are now Minnesota and Wisconsin. Read that again. The people the world associates with the Great Plains, the sweeping grasslands, the horizon of buffalo herds, the thunder of hooves, those same people were originally a woodland nation, forest people, lake people, people of the birch tree and the river. The Great Plains identity, the one sold in every Western film ever made, the one printed on every tourism brochure from South Dakota, it came later. It came because of displacement. It came because of war. It came because the Iroquois pushed them westward, and the world was never told. But here's where it gets far more complicated and far more extraordinary. The Sioux originally formed in the central Great Lakes region, around western Michigan and eastern Illinois, and migrated to the west after the Iroquois nation invaded Sioux territory. So the Plains identity, the entire cultural aesthetic by which the world recognizes the Sioux, is the result of a forced migration. The iconic image wasn't an origin. It was an adaptation. It was survival wearing new clothes. And when they arrived on the plains, they did not arrive defeated. They arrived, and within generations, they dominated. They became the most powerful military force on the entire North American continent. But the question that science has been quietly pursuing is this: where did they come from before that? Before Minnesota? Before Wisconsin? Before the Great Lakes? Where did the bloodline actually originate? The answer required technology that didn't exist until recently. It required the ability to extract functional DNA from materials that had been stored at room temperature for over a century, materials like hair. And it required a man named Ernie LaPointe, who had spent years insisting on something that scholars dismissed, politicians ignored, and institutions refused to confirm. He claimed he was the great-grandson of Tatanka Ayatake, Sitting Bull, the most famous Native American leader in history, the man whose name became synonymous with resistance, with spiritual power, with the last great stand of an unconquered people. A man's claim to be the great-grandson of legendary Native American leader Sitting Bull has been confirmed using DNA extracted from Sitting Bull's scalp lock. This is the first time ancient DNA has been used to confirm a familial relationship between living and historical individuals. And that confirmation, that single scientific confirmation, opened a door that changes everything, not just the story of one family, not just the question of where Sitting Bull's bones should be buried. The methodology that solved this mystery now makes it possible to interrogate the entire genetic history of the Sioux people at a level of precision that was previously unimaginable. The team that led this work was not a small operation. Professor S.K. Willerslev of the University of Cambridge and the Lundbeck Foundation Geogenetics Center led the analysis. Scientists obtained minor amounts of genomic data from a small piece of hair from Sitting Bull's scalp block, which was repatriated in 2007, and compared these data to genome-wide data from Ernie Laypoint and other Lakota Sioux using a new probabilistic approach. The hair had been sitting in the Smithsonian for decades, stored, cataloged, held, and when the science finally reached inside that sample, it didn't just find a family connection. It found a window into a genetic lineage stretching back thousands of years. And this is where everything changes. Because once scientists could read the DNA of the Lakota Sioux with this level of resolution, they could trace the deeper ancestry, the lineage, not of generations, but of millennia. And what that lineage reveals is a story of human movement so ancient, so sweeping, so geologically epic that it makes the whole debate about plains identity versus woodland identity look like a footnote. The Sioux, the Lakota, the Dakota, the Nakota, all branches of the Osage-Sakowin, carry in their blood the evidence of one of the most extraordinary journeys in the entire history of our species. According to the genetic record now available through decades of accumulated research, the ancestors of the Sioux people separated from Siberian and East Asian populations roughly 25,000 years ago. 25,000 years. At that time, the world looked nothing like it does today. The sea levels were dramatically lower. A landmass called Beringia, a stretch of terrain connecting what is now the Russian Far East to what is now Alaska, existed above the waterline. Previous genetic work had suggested the ancestors of Native Americans split from Siberians and East Asians about 25,000 years ago, perhaps when they entered the now mostly drowned landmass of Beringia, which bridged the Russian Far East and North America. These were not primitive wanderers stumbling southward by accident. These were organized human populations who had survived the last glacial maximum, one of the coldest, most brutal periods in Earth's recent history, and who carried the cognitive and physical adaptations to move into an entirely new world. But they didn't just walk straight through. That's the part the simplified version of history always skips. The gene pool of Native Americans is represented by unique haplogroups of mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome, the evolutionary age of which ranges from 13 to 22,000 years. What this tells scientists is that the founding populations, the ancestors of every single Native American nation, including the Sioux, spent thousands of years in Beringia before they moved south, isolated, developing, diverging genetically from their Asian relatives in a way that was so complete, so total, that the resulting haplogroups, the genetic markers that identify lineage, are found nowhere else on Earth. The ancestors of the Sioux carried genetic signatures that belong only to the Americas. They were not passing through. They were transforming. Think about what that means. While the ancient civilizations of Europe and the Middle East were still centuries away from their first great cities, the ancestors of the Lakota were already a genetically distinct people, already carrying a biological identity that science can now read in the DNA of a 19th century leader's hair. The continuity is not symbolic. It is molecular. And the molecular evidence doesn't stop there. A2, B2, C1, D1, and X2A. The A2, B2, C1, and D1 groups are estimated to have developed between 18,000 and 21,000 years ago. These haplogroups, these specific genetic signatures, are the biological fingerprints of the founding populations, and the Sioux carry them. When scientists read the DNA of Lakota individuals today and compare it against the ancient samples, against the genomic data gathered from remains spanning thousands of years across the Americas, the connection is continuous, unbroken, and undeniable. These people did not arrive from somewhere recent. Their roots in this land go back to the Ice Age itself. But wait, there is something about haplogroup X that deserves special attention. Because among all the Native American founding lineages, haplogroup X2A is the one that has triggered the most debate, the most controversy, the most uncomfortable academic conversations. There is no clear-cut genetic path across Beringia to the New World for X2A, meaning that X2A is not found in Siberia in the areas bordering Beringia. The ancestral form of the other Native American haplogroups are found there, indicating a clear migration path. This anomaly has fueled decades of alternative theories, theories about transatlantic contact, about ancient migrations from Europe, about connections to populations in the Middle East, and haplogroup X2A has been detected in Sioux-related populations. This is not a fringe claim. This is peer-reviewed science sitting in published journals, quietly disrupting the clean narrative about where these people came from. The mainstream interpretation, supported by the weight of genetic evidence, is that X2A also originated in Beringia, that the path simply hasn't been fully documented yet due to the limited testing of ancient Siberian remains. But the disruption it causes is real, and what it underscores is something even more powerful than any single theory. The origins of the Sioux people are more layered, more complex, more scientifically rich than any version of their story that has ever been presented to the general public. The narrative of a simple, singular migration, a line drawn from Asia across a land bridge and down into the Americas, is too clean. The DNA says something messier, something more magnificent. And then there is the third wave. In April 2026, researchers published findings in the journal Nature documenting something that upended decades of consensus. Scientists have long suspected that humans settled South America in two waves, one about 15,000 years ago, followed by another roughly 9,000 years ago. Now, with a new paper published in the journal Nature, researchers report finding evidence of a third, previously unknown wave, a third migration, a previously invisible movement of people, carrying their own genetic signatures, their own histories, their own ancestral memories, flowing into a continent that was already being shaped by those who came before. This wasn't a footnote. This was a structural revision of the entire model of how the Americas were peopled, and it forces a reconsideration of every population that carries complex genetic ancestry, including the Sioux. Because what the cumulative science now reveals is that the genetic story of Native American populations, including the Sioux, is not a single line. It is a braid, multiple ancestral threads woven over thousands of years, each one carrying the memory of a different journey, a different survival, a different adaptation to an ice age world that modern humans have never experienced and can barely imagine. An international study has, for the first time, deciphered the genome of Indigenous American populations, identifying over 1 million genetic variants not previously observed in other populations, revealing a unique genetic diversity. 1 million variants, not previously observed anywhere else in the world. The genetic uniqueness of Indigenous American populations, populations that include the Sioux, is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, quantifiable, scientifically documented fact. And yet, here is the brutal irony that sits at the center of all of this. While scientists were discovering this extraordinary genetic richness, while laboratories were uncovering evidence of migrations and adaptations and founding lineages that stretch back to the Ice Age, the living descendants of those lineages were being stripped of their land, their language, their children, and their legal identity in the same country where their ancestors had lived for 20,000 years. The DNA says these people are among the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. The United States government spent a century behaving as though they were new arrivals who needed to be civilized. But the DNA now asks a different question. Who, exactly, was the savage in that exchange? Who was the invader? The genome of the Lakota Sioux carries 25,000 years of North American history in its code. The European settlers who broke those treaties had been in the Americas for less than 3 centuries. The genetic record is not neutral. It takes sides. And it sides with the people who were there first, whose roots are so deep in this continent that they predate the formation of every modern nation on Earth by an incomprehensible margin. Now, consider the Sitting Bull DNA discovery in this context, and it transforms completely. This was not just a genealogical curiosity. This was not just about resolving a family dispute or deciding where a body should be buried. For archaeology, this breakthrough DNA technique means even tiny fragments of hair, bones, and teeth recovered from historic graves can now be examined in much higher resolution. Professor Willerslev explained that, theoretically, one could investigate whoever one wants, from outlaws like Jesse James to the Russian Tsar's family, the Romanovs. The technology that confirmed Ernie Lapointe's connection to Sitting Bull can now be applied to any ancient remains, including the remains of countless indigenous people held in museum collections across the United States and Europe without the consent of their descendants. This is not a small matter. Institutions across the Western world hold the remains of thousands of Native Americans, collected during the 19th and early 20th centuries under policies that can only be described as grave robbery with government sanction. The DNA technology that cracked Sitting Bull's lineage is the same technology that could now identify the descendants of every one of those individuals, that could give families back their ancestors, that could force governments and institutions to confront what they did. The science is not just historical, it is politically live, it is legally relevant, and the institutions holding those remains know it. What most people are not seeing is the scale of the reversal happening right now in academic and scientific circles. For decades, the dominant narrative around Native American populations, including the Sioux, operated on a set of comfortable assumptions, that these were isolated populations with limited genetic complexity, that their history could be understood through the lens of a simple migration story, that the gaps in the record were just gaps and not evidence of something more. Every one of those assumptions is collapsing simultaneously under the weight of genomic data that is accumulating faster than popular understanding can absorb. 2 independent studies published in Cell and in Science find that ancient populations expanded rapidly across the Americas about 13,000 years ago, emphasizing that the story continued in the thousands of years since, revealing previously undocumented large-scale movements between North and South America. The data include 64 newly sequenced ancient DNA samples from Alaska to Patagonia, spanning more than 10,000 years of genetic history. 10,000 years of genetic history, right across 64 samples, from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. And within that vast, sweeping data set, the patterns of movement, mixture, and isolation that produced peoples like the Sioux are visible in a resolution that historians working only from written records could never achieve, because the Sioux left no written records. What they left was more durable. They left their DNA. And within that DNA is a story of survival that borders on the supernatural. The founding population that crossed into the Americas did so under conditions of glacial cold, so extreme that modern humans cannot fully comprehend it. The ancestors of Native Americans arrived in mid-latitude North America, mainly along the Pacific Northwest coast, but had previously inhabited the Arctic, and during the last glacial maximum were in a refugium in Beringia. A refugium, a pocket of survival terrain surrounded by ice, where a small group of human beings kept their species alive in the New World during the coldest period in recent geological history. The Sioux are descended from those survivors, not distantly, directly. Their mitochondrial DNA, the genetic information passed exclusively through the maternal line, carries the signatures of those founding women who kept the lineage alive in Beringia, while glaciers covered the world. Continuity. And it changes the moral calculus of everything that followed. When the United States government implemented its policies of forced assimilation in the 19th and 20th centuries, when Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools where their languages were beaten out of them, where their names were replaced, where their cultural identities were systematically destroyed. It was doing this to people whose connection to the land was not philosophical or sentimental. It was genetic, it was biological, it was 20,000 years deep. The Sioux were not people who happened to live on land that someone else wanted. They were the land's oldest human expression. Their DNA says so. The genome doesn't lie, and it doesn't negotiate, and it doesn't sign treaties it intends to break. But here is where the story becomes something that demands to be taken seriously in the present tense, because this is not only history. The genetic research emerging from studies on Native American populations, including the landmark 2026 Nature paper on Indigenous genomic diversity, is revealing something with direct medical implications. The research identified over 1 million genetic variants not previously observed in other populations, revealing a unique genetic diversity. 1 million variants. Many of them are in regions of the genome associated with disease susceptibility, drug response, and immune function. Variants that standard medical databases, built primarily on European genomic data, have never accounted for. What this means in practice is that the Sioux and other indigenous populations have been receiving medical care calibrated to someone else's biology. Drugs tested on European genomes, risk factors modeled on European populations, medical guidelines written without their genetic profile in mind. The DNA research is not academic. It has stakes in every clinic on every reservation in the American Plains. And then there's the question of what comes next. Because the technology is accelerating. The database of ancient indigenous DNA is growing. The ability to trace lineages, confirm relationships, identify descendants, and reconstruct population movements is expanding every year. For the first time, an international study has deciphered the genome of indigenous American populations. Ancient DNA data was also incorporated to enable a deeper look into certain aspects of their history and evolution. The word "for the first time" carries enormous weight here. This is not a refinement of existing knowledge. This is the beginning of an entirely new chapter. What scientists are producing right now, in the years between 2021 and 2026, is the foundational genomic library of indigenous American populations. And the Sioux are central to it. What that library will eventually make possible is something that no treaty, no court ruling, no congressional act has ever managed to produce. An irrefutable, scientifically documented account of who was here, how long they were here, and what they built before the world arrived to take it from them. Not a narrative, not a claim, a genetic record, the kind that doesn't fade, doesn't burn, and cannot be legislated away. Consider for a moment what Ernie Lapointe must have felt when the results came back. When scientists from the University of Cambridge told him that the hair in the Smithsonian matched his own genome across thousands of data points, that the most famous resistance leader in Sioux history was, in verifiable molecular fact, his great-grandfather. Lapointe had said that over the years, many people have tried to question the relationship that he and his sisters have to Sitting Bull. Many people tried. For decades, the claims of his family were met with skepticism, bureaucratic obstruction, and institutional indifference. And then science walked in and ended the argument in a way that no human institution could refute. This is what DNA does. It doesn't care about politics. It doesn't care about what version of history is convenient. It reads the record that the body kept. And the body kept everything. The Sioux did not emerge from a mythology. They emerged from Asia 25,000 years ago, separated from relatives who became the Siberian peoples, spent thousands of years in a frozen land bridge developing a genetic identity unique to the Western Hemisphere, crossed into a new continent, spread south at a speed that still astonishes modern scientists, adapted to forests, to plains, to everything the land put in their path, built a political confederation that governed millions of acres, produced military strategies sophisticated enough to defeat the U.S. Army in open battle, and then survived centuries of systematic destruction designed to erase them, with enough genetic and cultural continuity intact that a 21st century laboratory in Cambridge, England could look at a strand of hair from a dead man's scalp lock and say, yes, this bloodline is real, this history is documented, this people are who they always said they were. The science is not giving the Sioux a new story. The science is confirming the story they already knew. What is new is that the rest of the world no longer has any scientific basis to doubt it. The DNA has spoken, and what it said is this: the people the world called Sioux, the people who called themselves Oseti-Sakoan, the people of the Seven Council Fires, so far were never what we thought. They were older, they were deeper. They were more genetically complex, more historically layered, more biologically remarkable than any narrative constructed about them by their conquerors has ever acknowledged. And the genomic work is still in its early stages. Researchers are still sequencing, still comparing, still discovering those million-plus genetic variants that belong to no other population on Earth, still tracing the third migration wave, whose origins and roots are not yet fully understood, still building the methodology that Professor Willerslev's team proved was possible, the one that can reach back into a strand of degraded, century-old hair and pull out a family tree, a bloodline, a truth. The question that should be keeping historians awake at night is not whether the science is accurate. It is. The question is what happens when this science is fully applied, when every ancient remain in every institution is genomically identified, when every descendant claim can be confirmed or denied with molecular precision, when the full genetic history of every Native American nation is written not in the language of colonial record-keeping, but in the language of the genome itself. What happens to the treaties then? What happens to the land claims? What happens to the legal frameworks built on the assumption that these people's connections to specific places are historical sentiment rather than biological fact? What happens when the DNA of the Lakota Sioux stands in a courtroom and says, in the only language that cannot be forged, we were here before your nation existed. We were here before your language existed. We were here before the ice melted and the land you call yours emerged from the water. Our roots in this soil are not cultural. They are genetic. They are 25,000 years deep. And now finally, you have the technology to verify every word. The story of the Sioux was never what we thought. And the story of what comes next? That story has not yet been written. But the DNA already knows how it ends.